The year is 1876. To the Easterner, the American West was a grand stage painted with heroism, a world of dashing cowboys, fierce but noble gunfights, and an endless sun-drenched horizon promising instant freedom and fortune. This was the narrative spun in dime novels, fueled by the breathless yearning for a life unburdened by the industrial clock. The cowboy, in this myth, was a figure of rugged individualism, a solitary king riding across his open, unfenced dominion. This image of a leather-clad philosopher on horseback remains the West's most powerful export. But to Jim Bridger, or any of the 20-something men working the long cattle drives out of Texas, the reality was a slow, grinding misery. The trail was less a stage for glory and more a moving oven, furnace, or freezing hell, depending on the week. The cowboy wasn't a romantic gunfighter. He was a hired hand, often black, Mexican, or a young white veteran, earning maybe $40 a month plus keep, a wage barely above subsistence. His horse was not a majestic steed, but a dusty, overworked creature, and his chief companions were the smell of unwashed wool, hot leather, and the incessant lowing of thousands of longhorn cattle. The most constant threat wasn't a cinematic outlaw, but the weather. The sudden, terrifying hailstorms that spooked a herd into a deadly stampede, or the relentless, lung-choking dust that turned water into a muddy luxury. On the trail, the days were brutal. The men would rise before the first hint of sun, enduring hours in the saddle, nudging the massive, slow-moving herd north toward the railheads in Kansas. The work was monotonous, demanding endless vigilance against rustlers, yes, but mostly against the cattle wandering off or eating poisonous weeds. Ranching, post-Civil War, was less about individual heroism and more about corporate logistics. Eastern capital, hungry for cheap beef, poured money into the Great Plains, transforming the open range into a profitable, speculative enterprise. The real revolution on the frontier wasn't the six-shooter, but barbed wire, patented in 1874. This invention, derisively called the devil's rope by some, allowed ranchers to cheaply and effectively carve the supposedly endless plains into private fenced-off grazing territory. This simple piece of twisted metal swiftly killed the era of the great free-roaming cattle drives. Suddenly, the open range became a collection of large private holdings. The legendary cowboy was increasingly replaced by the more sedentary, fence-mending ranch hand. Instead of riding for months, he was now responsible for repairing miles of wire, dealing with the disastrous consequences of blizzards trapping fenced herds, and confronting other ranchers in petty, localized land disputes, the mundane beginnings of the range wars. Life in the towns was equally unglamorous. While saloons and bordellos certainly existed, they were hardly the focal points of daily existence. The average citizen was a homesteader, a shopkeeper, a barber, or a bank clerk, people desperate for order, not chaos. They welcomed the arrival of the railroad, not for dramatic train robberies, but because it connected them to markets, mail, and the outside world. The lawlessness was not a romantic, anarchic freedom. It was a devastating impediment to prosperity, and the towns generally strove to extinguish it quickly. The true hardship of the post-Civil War West was the cultural and ecological destruction. The great herds of bison were nearly exterminated, a strategic blow to the sustenance of the indigenous nations who had lived on the land for millennia. As the railroad pushed through, indigenous peoples were systematically removed, confined to reservations, and forced to abandon their traditional ways of life, a profound tragedy that the dime novels studiously ignored. The romantic image of the lone rider fighting for freedom was a convenient national fiction, crafted to justify the cost of the brutal, messy process of settlement and disease. Yet standing in a newly electrified city street on a winter night in 1890, Watching the electric trolleys glide silently past buildings powered by invisible current, one felt an undeniable truth. The world, driven by a few geniuses and a powerful industrial machine, was utterly, irrevocably new. The American spirit had been remade in the image of the machine, efficient, ambitious, and relentlessly forward-moving. The air in 1920s America was thick with contradictions. On the surface, the nation had achieved a moral triumph. The 18th Amendment had been ratified, and the Volstead Act had made the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors illegal. America, officially, was dry. This was the era of earnest temperance leagues, Sunday piety, and the promised decline of societal vice. Yet beneath this veneer of righteous abstinence, the country was undergoing a cultural fermentation so potent it required secret passwords and hidden doorways just to access its true spirit. This was the age of the Roaring Twenties, a dizzying decade of jazz, flapper dresses, and a defiant hunger for pleasure fueled directly by the very law intended to suppress it. Prohibition, rather than eliminating drinking, merely pushed it indoors and underground, creating the vibrant, clandestine institution of the speakeasy. To enter a speakeasy, a name derived from the need to speak easy or quietly about the place to avoid police detection, was to step into an alternate reality. You wouldn't find a grand sign, perhaps just a discreet side entrance, a whispered word to a sharp-eyed bouncer, and the click of a hidden latch. Inside, the world was alive. The air was smoky, scented with cheap perfume and low-quality, often dangerous, homemade liquor. Women in shortened hemlines and strings of pearls, the radical, liberated flappers, danced the Charleston alongside men in slick suits. Jazz, an electric new sound born of African-American culture in New Orleans, posed from a corner band, its improvisational rhythm perfectly mirroring the chaotic freedom of the age. The paradox was that the moral crusade of prohibition became the greatest unintended catalyst for organized crime in American history. Supplying the nation's unquenchable thirst was a logistical nightmare and a financial goldmine. Enter the bootleggers and the mob bosses, figures like Al Capone in Chicago, who turned illegal liquor distribution into a highly efficient, multi-million-dollar enterprise. Capone famously remarked, "All I ever did was supply a public demand." These criminal syndicates controlled the entire supply chain, from running stills in the countryside to smuggling liquor across the borders from Canada and the Caribbean, to distributing it through a massive network of speakeasies. The end and corruption required to maintain this control, the territorial gang wars, the bribing of police and politicians, became commonplace, shattering public faith in law enforcement and local government. The very act of enforcing the moral law resulted in a massive, systemic breakdown of civic morality. Culturally, the speakeasy became a revolutionary space. It was one of the few places in American society where, for a time, racial and class lines became temporarily blurred in the pursuit of illegal fun. More significantly, it shattered rigid gender segregation. Before Prohibition, saloons were almost exclusively male domains. The speakeasy, designed to be inconspicuous and often housed in former tea rooms or apartments, welcomed women, transforming drinking into a fashionable social activity. This newfound freedom in public spaces was central to the identity of the flapper, a woman who smoked, drank, and asserted a radical independence previously denied to her. By the end of the decade, the grand social experiment of prohibition was widely regarded as a failure. It hadn't reformed the nation. It had merely criminalized a large portion of it, enriched mobsters, and created an intoxicating, defiant cultural revolution. The speakeasy, that secret, smoky haven of jazz.
The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, did more than launch the United States into World War II. It detonated a social time bomb that instantly redefined American gender roles. As millions of young men traded their civilian clothes for military uniforms, the nation faced an unprecedented crisis of labor. Factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners had to be rapidly converted to manufacture bombers, tanks, and ammunition. To keep the gears of the arsenal of democracy turning, America turned to an untapped resource: its women. Suddenly, the familiar advertisements depicting women as meticulous homemakers were replaced by a new, powerful symbol: Rosie the Riveter. This iconic image of a strong, muscular woman flexing her bicep, wearing a bandana and proclaiming, "We can do it," was a nationwide call to action. It was a calculated, government-backed propaganda effort designed to pull women from the home and into heavy industry. And they answered. Roughly 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, many taking on jobs that had been strictly reserved for men. They worked in shipyards, riveting steel plates onto destroyers. They assembled fuselages for B-17 flying fortresses in vast aircraft plants. They became welders, machinists, and lumberjacks. They worked dangerous, exhausting shifts, often dealing with crude conditions and the constant risk of injury. The hands that had once managed delicate embroidery now maneuvered heavy wrenches and soldering irons. This shift was not just about the numbers, it was about the changing public perception of capability. Before the war, deeply ingrained societal norms dictated that women were too fragile, too emotional, or simply lacked the mechanical aptitude for industrial work. Wartime necessity proved these prejudices utterly false. Women demonstrated that they were not only capable, but often excelled at complex, detailed work. The war proved that the only thing stopping a woman from becoming a mechanic was the opportunity. Beyond the factories, women also took on crucial roles in public life and the military support structures.
They showed the generation that followed that there was an alternative path. One could reject the American dream of suburban happiness and still live a life rich with meaning, even if it meant being broke, misunderstood, and constantly on the road. The Beat generation effectively punctured the polite, sanitized facade of the 1950s, proving that America's soul was far more restless and yearning than its carefully curated television commercials suggested. The mid-20th century in America was a time when the nation's stated ideals, equality and freedom, clashed violently with the reality of deeply entrenched racial segregation, particularly in the South. The civil rights movement was the historic and moral force that rose to resolve this contradiction, guided by principles of nonviolent resistance and waged through methodical legislative battles. The movement's modern flashpoint arrived in 1955. Following the arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger, the African-American community of Montgomery, Alabama, launched the Montgomery bus boycott. This event introduced the world to its most recognized figure, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A young Baptist minister, King articulated the movement's core philosophy, rooted in the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and Christian theology, a commitment to nonviolent direct action, or satyagraha, meaning truth force. The boycott, which lasted 381 days and crippled the city's transit system, proved that coordinated nonviolent economic pressure could force change. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregated buses unconstitutional. Victory in Montgomery provided a crucial blueprint. The movement quickly scaled up, forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, led by King, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNNC, which mobilized youth. The next phase focused on challenging segregation in public facilities through nonviolent means. In 1960, the Greensboro sit-ins began. 4 African-American college students sat down at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter and refused to leave after being denied service. They returned day after day, their numbers swelling until they filled the entire counter. This tactic spread like wildfire, becoming the defining image of the movement: dignified, quiet resistance in the face of angry, often violent harassment. These actions were designed to force a moral confrontation, exposing the brutality of segregation on national television and shifting public opinion. The federal government was forced to intervene repeatedly.
In 1961, the Freedom Riders, black and white activists, rode interstate buses into the Deep South to challenge non-enforcement of Supreme Court rulings against segregated travel facilities. They met fierce, organized violence in Alabama, which resulted in President John F. Kennedy sending federal marshals to protect the riders and pressure the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue stricter desegregation rules. The movement's pivot to legislation became undeniable in 1963. After a brutal response by Police Commissioner Bull Connor to nonviolent protests in Birmingham, Alabama, where children were famously hosed and attacked by police dogs, King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail. This eloquent defense of civil disobedience galvanized supporters nationwide. This culminated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963, where over 250,000 people gathered to hear King deliver his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The legislative pressure became irresistible, leading to the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was the most significant piece of civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction era. Yet the fight was not over. African Americans still faced systemic denial of the right to vote. The campaign for voting rights culminated in the 1965 marches from Selma,
providing the soundtrack, the philosophy, and often the venue for their political gatherings, most famously at Woodstock in 1969. This new identity was marked by a deep suspicion of authority. The government, the military, the police, and the traditional media were all viewed as components of a manipulative system that lied to maintain power. This suspicion was brutally cemented by events like the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where police violently clashed with anti-war demonstrators, and tragically, the 1970 Kent state shootings, where National Guardsmen killed 4 unarmed student protesters. By the decade's end, the youth counterculture had fundamentally changed American life. While the hippie communities eventually dispersed and the political movement splintered, they left an indelible legacy. They initiated environmentalism, pushed for gender equality, redefined popular music, and introduced a permanent, healthy skepticism towards governmental power that continues to shape American political discourse today. The 60s shattered the illusions of post-war homogeneity, revealing a younger generation determined to forge a more honest, if more chaotic, definition of the American dream. The 1970s arrived in America not with the hopeful, defiant roar of the previous decade, but with a sudden, unnerving silence, the silence of an engine running out of gas. This decade was defined by economic stagnation, political humility, and a painful realization that American power was no longer absolute, particularly when challenged by global resource politics. The confluence of the 1970s energy crises, the subsequent surge in environmental awareness, and new geopolitical struggles fundamentally reshaped the national psyche. The most immediate shock came in October 1973. Following the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, imposed an oil embargo against countries perceived as supporting Israel, including the United States. This political maneuver instantly revealed America's critical and vulnerable dependence on foreign oil. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Gas prices skyrocketed, and the nation faced severe shortages. Long lines snaked for blocks outside gas stations, often leading to rationing, frayed tempers, and occasional violence. The massive gas-guzzling American cars, the symbols of post-war affluence, suddenly seemed like wasteful anachronisms. The embargo forced Americans to confront a stark reality. Their daily mobility and economic well-being were now subject to decisions made thousands of miles away by nations they had previously ignored. The era of cheap, boundless energy was definitively over.
This economic shock was compounded by a growing environmental awareness that had been quietly building since the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the early 1960s. The energy crisis provided a stark, practical reason to link environmentalism with national security and economic stability. If relying on foreign oil was dangerous, the argument went, then developing domestic, sustainable alternatives was patriotic. President Richard Nixon responded to this emerging consciousness by signing the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, in 1970, and creating the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The first Earth Day in April 1970 mobilized millions, transforming environmental concern from a fringe issue into a mainstream political force. Suddenly, people worried not only about smog and polluted rivers, but also about energy consumption and the long-term impact of fossil fuels. The energy crisis helped popularize solar power, insulation, and the concept of conservation, turning the once maligned compact car into a symbol of smart consumption. Simultaneously, America was grappling with profound At the time, human-to-human communication was slow, deliberate, and expensive. Letters took days. Long-distance phone calls were timed, costing a fortune per minute. Information felt heavy and finite. But the personal computer brought with it the seeds of change. Ilara noticed how her customers, mostly hobbyists and small business owners, began using their Phoenixes not just for spreadsheets, but for something called electronic mail, email, often through clunky dial-up bulletin board systems, BBS. "Reese," she said one evening, pointing to a flickering green cursor on a black screen, "look at this. Agnes from the flower shop in San Jose is sending her monthly inventory list to a distributor in Oakland. It's instantaneous. It costs almost nothing." It was a mundane transaction, yet utterly profound. It bypassed the postal service, the telephone company, and the entire structure of regulated, slow communication. The computer, initially a complex, specialized tool, was slowly and quietly transforming into a universal translator, a medium for instant human connection. The change wasn't sudden. It was a decade-long process. The first personal computers were focused on the solitary user, the writer, the accountant, the gamer. But the network, the slow, scratchy dial-up connection to other machines, was the true sleeper agent of change. By the mid-'80s, the Phoenix was gone, a casualty of bigger players like IBM and Apple. But Ilara and Reese had pivoted, launching one of the first successful commercial email services. They no longer built the hardware, but they owned the digital pathways. Looking out of her small, sunny office window, no longer a garage, Ilara saw not just microchips and venture funds, but a world shrinking. A teenager in her garage was now connected to a professor across the country. A protest group could coordinate faster than the authorities could react. The transformation of communication, slow in its initial adoption, was now accelerating exponentially, turning the world's vast distances into mere clicks. The quiet revolution, born in the garages of Silicon Valley, had finally found its voice. The year was 1993, and the scent of the city was changing. It was no longer just the heavy, familiar smell of diesel, hot pretzels, and old masonry. Now, in the stretch of Queens known as Jackson Heights, the air held the sharp, fragrant promise of cumin, coriander, and freshly fried samosas, a culinary map drawn by a new wave of American arrivals. Mina, born in Dhaka but raised under the vibrant, shifting skies of New York, worked the counter at Desh Bazaar, her family's grocery store. The shop had started small in the 1970s, a direct consequence of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. That landmark legislation had abolished the old, racially biased national origins quota system, replacing it with a preference system favoring family reunification and skilled labor. It was a change that didn't just open doors, it fundamentally reshaped the country's demographic soul. The first wave in their neighborhood had been a handful of doctors and engineers, skilled professionals, many from Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Philippines, arriving under the employment preferences. They were the trailblazers. Then, due to the family reunification clauses, their siblings, parents, and cousins followed, creating deep, intricate familial roots. Jackson Heights became one of the quintessential examples of this post-1965 transformation. Once a predominantly Irish and Italian working-class neighborhood, it was now a dizzying, beautiful mix, a sixth borough, where the Bangla, Spanish, and Nepali languages mingled on the street corners. Mina's friend Javier, whose parents arrived from El Salvador fleeing civil conflict in the 1980s, ran the pupuseria 2 blocks down. Her landlord, Mr. Lee, was a Korean veteran of the Vietnam War who ran a dry cleaner. They were a testament to the changing demographics of major U.S. cities, where the influx of new immigrants, largely from Latin America and Asia, revitalized old urban centers and gave
Floors were loud, chaotic pits. By the 1990s, there were quiet rooms filled with the soft hum of servers and the flickering glow of multiple monitors. The leveraged boom of the 1980s. The first great surge Elias witnessed was the boom of the mid to late 1980s. Under the era of deregulation and corporate restructuring, the watchword was leverage. Junk bonds, championed by figures like Michael Milken, fueled aggressive corporate takeovers. Companies were being bought, broken up, and reassembled with dizzying speed. Elias was working in mergers and acquisitions then. He remembered the adrenaline-fueled nights, the exorbitant deal fees, and the widespread feeling that the party would never end. The stock market soared, driven by optimism and readily available credit. New wealth seemed to materialize out of thin air. Then came the bust. It began with the savings and loan crisis, where deregulated institutions engaged in risky lending that led to massive failures. This was compounded by the sudden shock of the Black Monday crash in October 1987, a spectacular one-day collapse where the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 22%. Elias, standing on the trading floor as the numbers flashed crimson, felt the immediate, chilling retraction of the boom mentality. The lavish spending stopped. Layoffs followed. It was a cleansing fire, he later reflected. It taught everyone that gravity still existed, even on Wall Street. The ensuing recession, which deepened in the early 1990s, was a painful reminder that excess always demanded a price. The digital mania of the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, a new, far more intoxicating wave began to crest, the dot-com bubble. This boom was driven by a genuine, world-changing technology, the Internet, but distorted by speculative mania. Elias had moved to a nascent venture capital firm specializing in technology. He watched as companies with no revenue, shaky business plans, and names ending in .com went public and reached multi-billion-dollar valuations overnight. The rules were suspended, Elias told his younger partners. P/E ratios didn't matter. Profits were old economy. It was all about eyeballs and future potential. Money poured into the sector at an unprecedented rate. Everyone, from taxi drivers to retirees, was trying to buy into the next Amazon or Yahoo. It was a true democratization of speculation, far wider than the leverage boom of the 80s. The NASDAQ index became the barometer of this intoxicating optimism, hitting dizzying new peaks almost daily. The peak came in March 2000. Elias had a gut feeling. He saw too many companies spending millions on Super Bowl ads who hadn't figured out how to charge for their service. He began quietly divesting his firm's most inflated holdings. The bust that followed was brutal. Starting in the spring of 2000, the bubble burst with a vengeance. The NASDAQ began a steep, relentless decline that wiped out trillions of dollars in market capitalization over the next 2 years. Hundreds of dot-com companies folded, jobs evaporated, and many retail investors saw their life savings vanish. The fallout was more psychological than the factory floor, once a roaring engine of American industry, fell quiet. The silence was deafening.
It wasn't just the loss of 1,200 jobs, it was the unraveling of a community. The local diners closed, the tax base evaporated, and the Union Hall became a mausoleum of lost promise. Frank, then 52, received a severance package that felt insultingly small. His deep, technical knowledge of die casting was useless to the burgeoning service economy. He tried training programs, attempting to learn computer programming, but the intellectual leap was too great, and the entry-level wages were a fraction of what he had earned. He ended up working as a security guard at a newly built distribution center, a massive automated warehouse where the goods manufactured by his former company, now made in Shenzhen, were sorted and shipped. The irony was a bitter pill. He was guarding the supply chain of his own obsolescence. One day, he went back to the old UAW hall. The doors were locked, the paint peeling. He remembered the feeling of unity, the strength that came from standing together against the bosses, and the pride of knowing his work mattered. The late 20th century had promised a future of prosperity, but for Frank and millions like him, that future was built on the backs of lower-wage workers far away, leaving a void in America's industrial heartlands. The era of the powerful, well-paid industrial worker was fading, replaced by the uncertainty of the gig economy and the deep, challenging questions of what it means to earn a decent living in a globalized world. Major Sarah Sal Kincaid felt the chill of history in the airless office at Fort Bragg. It was 1991. The Berlin Wall was a memory, and the Soviet Union, the adversary that had defined her entire military career, was collapsing. The exhilarating yet terrifying clarity of the Cold War doctrine was gone. In its place was a complicated, confusing, and violent vacuum. The world had gone from a binary superpower standoff to a fractured landscape plagued by regional turmoil. This new era was characterized by the swift, moral ambiguities of post-Cold War conflicts. Sarah's first deployment reflecting this new reality was Somalia in 1993. It was a humanitarian mission turned kinetic, a descent from delivering aid to fighting decentralized, localized militias. It wasn't about tanks battling tanks or strategic nuclear deterrence. It was about nation building, stability operations, and the horrifying close-quarters urban combat later immortalized at the Battle of Mogadishu. The goal was no longer simply containment, but intervention. "We were trained for World War III," Sarah told her squad leader after the mission, the memory of the dead haunting her. "We ended up fighting 1,000 little wars, tribal, ethnic, resource-based in places the Pentagon barely knew existed." The late 1980s saw the American military pivot repeatedly. Peace enforcement in Bosnia, intervention in Kosovo. The conflicts were framed as moral imperatives, driven by the desire to stop mass atrocities, a doctrine dubbed R2P, responsibility to protect. The role of the American soldier was transitioning from defender of the free world to global peacekeeper and police force. The new adversary. But a shadow was growing, subtle, yet pervasive. The phrase was not meant to celebrate victory or lament defeat, but to encourage reflection on the central themes and legacy of the saga, the long, brutal chain of choices that led her world to its current, fragile peace. The central themes: choice and consequence. The saga's heart lay in two opposing cities: Eiffel, the shining bastion of technological progress, and Kalen, the walled city that clung fiercely to its ancient spiritual traditions. The war was sparked by Eiffel's relentless pursuit of the Sunstone, an artifact Kalen deemed sacred. Eliana's narrative meticulously tracked the core themes. 1. The illusion of necessity. The Eiffel Chronicles always justified the conflict as necessary for progress. The Sunstone's energy was needed for their flying machines and impossible lights. Eliana highlighted the counter-narrative that this necessity was a self-fulfilling prophecy, masking a simple lust for power and expansion. The legacy of Ithel was a lesson in the dangers of conflating ambition with destiny. 2. The price of preservation. The Kaelenes fought to preserve their culture at all costs. Yet, Eliana noted, in doing so, they became as ruthless as their enemies, sacrificing the very compassion they claimed to defend. The legacy of KLN was a testament to how the act of fighting can corrupt the thing being fought for. 3. The cycle of vengeance. The conflict was primarily fueled by reciprocal acts of cruelty, each generation inheriting the blood debt of the previous one. Eliana made a deliberate choice in her writing to detail the suffering equally on both sides, demonstrating that in the end, the distinction between victim and aggressor had blurred into meaninglessness. The legacy in the ashes. Eliana wrote the conclusion not just for scholars, but for the children growing up in the post-war settlements, children who knew the war only as ruins and cautionary tales. The true legacy of the 300 Years' War, she argued, was not the treaty signed or the borders redrawn, but the inheritance of its failures. The peace you live in, she wrote in her final lines, was not won by a grand hero or a final brilliant strategy. It was a failure of